Hey anatomy folks, I want to apologize for not getting this up sooner. I was really continually having tech issues all afternoon. Tried it again this morning, laptop updated again. Maybe it's time to get a new one, but anyway, I think we're in the process of getting through these last notes screencast. I'll get them posted ASAP. So the final part of Chapter 2 notes, we got quite a few from the whiteboard, and we're continuing to wrap things up for Chapter 2 here. So I'll do my best. We know a lot of things about water, but water was a focal point in the Lake Superior College professor's notes, and so I want to make sure I mention some things about water specifically in relationship to us as living things, because it's obviously something we all need. So here are some things to keep in mind about water and thinking about why it's so important to us. The sum total of all the chemical reactions in your body is called your metabolism. And in order for that metabolism and those chemical reactions to work, water is necessary as a medium, a solvent for all of the things that are dissolved into it, into your cells, for those chemical reactions to work. So, critical. Another important thing about water is that it helps maintain or moderate our temperature and keep it stable for our bodies. In part because water has a high heat capacity. And that high heat capacity just means it takes a lot of energy to warm up water. You probably experienced that with lakes in Minnesota. You get a hot spring day and the air temperature is nice and warm, but the water is slow to warm up. Or likewise, if we get a cool day today or in the fall, the water has been warmed all summer and it's probably still pretty warm. Part of this high heat capacity comes from what we learned before about polarity in water. That means that it has a positive end and a negative end to the molecule because the oxygen atom holds the electron pair closer to itself. And so we talked about electronegativity and this polarity that's created in these molecules. That gives them the ability to stick to one another, called cohesion, and is able to create surface tension in water. And then also water is a good lubricant, so there's very little friction between water molecules. All right. Wanted to make sure we talked a little bit about chemical notation and chemical reactions. So here's a chemical reaction, and the stuff on the left is interacting to form the stuff on the right. Hopefully you know that there's reactants on the left, products on the right, and the arrow shows the direction in which the chemical reaction is going. When we look at H2O or CO2, these are chemical formulas, so you want to understand that that's what you're looking at. And the chemical formulas sometimes have little numbers. These are called subscripts. And it tells you how many numbers of molecule or numbers of atoms go into that molecule. If there's no subscript, it's assumed as 1. But there is a problem with our equation here. So chemical equation showing a chemical reaction. And that problem is it's not balanced. Chemical reactions need to follow the conservation of matter. And so there has to be the same amount of, molecular speaking or atom-wise, there has to be the same amount of matter on both sides. So we have to balance it. And we can add numbers in front of the molecules called coefficients. So if we add a 6 here, a 6 here, and a 6 here, now we can look at how many hydrogens on this side. 6 times 2 It's 12. And over here you got 12. How many carbons over here? 6 and 6. So, balanced chemical equation. We also want to think about types of reactions. So what type of reaction takes smaller molecules and makes bigger molecules? Well, I'm hopeful that you know that that would be a synthesis reaction. Smaller molecules added together to make bigger molecules is synthesis. This happens to be the equation for photosynthesis. One equation that you have already seen many times. But sometimes we have large molecules being broken down into smaller molecules. That would be decomposition. So when your cells are breaking down glucose right here and ending up making carbon dioxide and water as a byproduct, that's a decomposition reaction that's part of cellular respiration. So building up, synthesis, breakdown, decomposition. All right, which organic molecule makes up most of your structure? Well, I hope that you can go back to that chart and say protein. What is the monomer or the building block of protein? I hope you're able to already answer that the monomer of protein is amino acids, and there are 20. So amino acid, 20 different amino acids go together in different arrangements to make all the different proteins are made of. So these are just examples. And amino acids, hopefully you can identify the functional groups of an amino acid, carboxyl and amino. And then this R group is what makes it the specific kind that it is. And when amino acids come together and form chains to make, that would be a synthesis. And for the case of protein building, the covalent bond that joins two amino acids together is called a peptide bond. Peptide bond. So here's an amino acid peptide bond, another amino acid peptide bond. And so they form these long chains. What kind of chemical reaction combines amino acids to make up proteins, or simple sugars to make complex carbohydrates? So when we make that chain of polypeptide, amino acids put together, when we make starch or glycogen in our cells, complex carbohydrate, that's a synthesis, but it has a type of name that we want to call dehydration synthesis. Dehydration synthesis. So chemically, why is it being called dehydration? If we look at this example of dehydration synthesis, here is a monomer added to another monomer. When doing so, an H and an O and another H leave and become water. So they've been dehydrated, loss of water. And now just the oxygen is left bonded covalently, and now these two monomers become a polymer as you add more and more. On the flip side, when we break down our food in digestion, decomposition reaction is what we're talking about, but we're talking about a special kind of dehydration, or excuse me, a special kind of decomposition reaction known as hydrolysis. Hydrolysis, lysis means to split, and hydro means with water. So we are splitting with water. So if you look at this covalent bond here, if it's to be digested and broken down, water is added, and the two H's and the O get added right here, right here. And so now you have two separate monomers that have been split with water. So make sure when we talk about synthesis and decomposition reactions that you understand dehydration synthesis versus hydrolysis. What happens to polypeptide chains as they form? Well, they change shape. So you have a primary structure as the amino acids come linked together in a long polypeptide chain at the ribosome. However, they don't stay a long skinny chain. They start to fold over and link together with hydrogen bonds. So these dotted lines are hydrogen bonds. So this folding over on itself is called the secondary structure. And then the folds sometimes fold again on top of each other, creating something called the tertiary structure. So what's happening is these hydrogen bonds are causing a three-dimensional arrangement in this molecule. And it's the three-dimensional shape of these molecules that causes them to work the way that they do. So primary structure, the chains, first fold, secondary structure, folds upon folds, tertiary structure, and then sometimes tertiary structures of proteins can get connected to one another, again through hydrogen bonding. So even though these are separate initial polypeptide chains, they might link together and form what's known as a quaternary structure. And so just kind of want you to understand that when protein is made, hydrogen bonds help form it into its three-dimensional structure that it will eventually have for its functioning in you. All right, one of those important proteins is called an enzyme. We had that in lab, and so I want you to think about that, or I want you to remember that lab and which enzyme we were talking about. But enzymes are functional proteins. They're described as catalysts in your body's many chemical reactions, also known as your metabolism. A catalyst means it helps speed up or facilitate that chemical reaction. So do you remember the enzyme we had in the potato lab, potato experiment? That was called catalase. It breaks down hydrogen peroxide in our cells, which hydrogen peroxide is a toxic byproduct of our cells' metabolism. So potatoes need it, our cells need it. So how do they work? Well, they work on their three-dimensional structure. That three-dimensional structure of an enzyme creates an area three-dimensionally that fits whatever it's working on. So the area that interacts with the substance of reaction, that three-dimensional area is called the active site. So this is the active site of the enzyme, and it's three-dimensionally meant to fit hydrogen peroxide in this case. So whatever the enzyme acts on is called the substrate. And so in this case, hydrogen peroxide is the substrate interacting with the enzyme, and it facilitates the breakup of hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen gas, which is what we got in our lab. This graph is just there's a similar one in your book, but it is helping you notice or understand that chemical reactions could happen without enzymes, but to do so would take more activation energy. Your cells might still spend some activation energy to get the chemical reaction to occur, but the enzyme helps reduce the amount of energy needed to start that chemical reaction. And so that's the key to enzymes. They reduce needed activation energy for chemical reactions to happen. So make sure you look at that, read over that information about enzymes in the reading, and feel free to ask questions that you might have on Chapter 2.